Story number 1.
When I was in my early 20s, I moved into a small, rundown apartment in the city. It was affordable, and for a recent college graduate, that was all that mattered. The building itself was old, creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and dark hallways that always seemed colder than they should have been. But despite its age, the rent was cheap and the location was perfect, so I signed the lease without hesitation. The first few days were normal. The apartment was quiet, the neighbors kept to themselves, and I settled into a routine. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was mine, and that felt like a small victory. Then came the first night. It was raining heavily and the wind howled outside, making the old windows rattle. I had just gotten into bed, the soft hum of the heater the only sound in the room. But as I closed my eyes, I heard something. Scratching. It was faint, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere in the walls, like something was trying to claw its way out. I froze. My heart raced in my chest. I listened intently, trying to determine if I had imagined it. The scratching continued for a few more minutes before it suddenly stopped. I chalked it up to the old pipes, or perhaps a rodent in the walls, though I didn't want to believe that. I managed to fall asleep, but the feeling of unease lingered. The following night, the same thing happened. The scratching started again, this time louder, as though whatever was in the walls was getting closer. I couldn't ignore it this time. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the rain outside mingling with the disturbing noise coming from within the walls. My pulse quickened, but I didn't dare get up to investigate. The thought of finding something in the walls, something I couldn't explain, paralyzed me with fear. It went on for weeks. Every night the scratching would return, sometimes soft, sometimes more insistent. It never seemed to happen during the day, just at night when I was alone, trying to sleep. I started to lose track of time, my mind consumed by the noise, my body exhausted from sleepless nights. I tried everything, closing the windows, turning up the volume on the TV to drown out the sound, but nothing worked. The scratching continued, relentless. Then one night I decided to confront it. I couldn't live like this anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and walked to the wall where the scratching seemed to be coming from. I pressed my ear against the cold plaster, heart hammering in my chest, and listened. There it was again, faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from behind the wall, but the sound was so sharp, so deliberate. I backed away, my mind racing, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't afford to move out, and I didn't have anyone to talk to. I felt trapped. But the next day I called the landlord. I explained the situation, telling him about the scratching and how it had been keeping me awake. He seemed annoyed but promised to send someone over to check the walls for any signs of damage or pests. That afternoon, a maintenance man arrived. He was a tall, thin man with an unkempt beard. He seemed to be in his mid-50s, with tired eyes that didn't seem to take anything seriously. He didn't say much as he walked around the apartment, tapping the walls and inspecting the pipes. When he reached the wall where the scratching had been the loudest, he paused. His eyes narrowed and he pressed his ear against the plaster, just like I had done. He stayed like that for a few moments, listening. Then he straightened up and muttered something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a certain urgency in his voice. Without saying anything else, he started to leave. "Wait," I called after him, panic rising in my chest. "What's going on? What's in the walls?" He turned to me, his face pale. "I'll have someone come to look at it tomorrow," he said, his voice flat. "Don't worry about it." But I didn't feel reassured. The way he looked at me, the way he avoided my gaze, it felt like he was hiding something. The next day, I decided to do my own research. I went through the building's history, searching for anything that could explain the strange occurrences. After hours of sifting through old records, I found something. The apartment building had once been a house, owned by a man named Charles who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances many years ago. There were rumors that Charles had been involved in some sort of illegal activity, but nothing was ever confirmed. What struck me the most, though, was a small note at the bottom of the article. It said that Charles had been last seen near the basement before vanishing. The building's records after that were sparse, and no one seemed to know what had happened to him. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in the walls, whatever had been scratching at night, was somehow connected to Charles. But I couldn't prove it. That night, the scratching was louder than ever. It sounded almost frantic, like whatever was behind the wall was trying to escape. I was at my breaking point. I grabbed my keys and left the apartment, determined to get some fresh air and clear my head. When I returned a few hours later, something was different. The front door was ajar. I froze. My first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the feeling that whatever was in the apartment wasn't just a break-in. It was something worse. Slowly, I stepped inside, the silence pressing down on me. I walked down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thick, like something was suffocating the space around me. When I reached my bedroom door, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly open, just enough for me to see inside. I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat as I glanced around the room. Everything seemed normal, nothing was out of place. But then my gaze fell to the wall near the bed. The plaster was cracked, and in the center of the crack was something disturbing. A handprint. It wasn't a normal handprint. It was smeared, like someone had pressed their hand against the wall and dragged it downward. But there was no way anyone had been in my apartment. No way anyone could have made that print. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that whatever had been scratching at the walls had somehow left its mark on my bedroom. Terrified, I ran out of the apartment and called the landlord, demanding to know what was going on. He was hesitant to talk, but eventually he admitted that the building had been troubled for years. People had gone missing in the past. Tenants, maintenance workers, and even some visitors. But it was never reported to the authorities. The landlord had been trying to sell the building for years, but no one would buy it. He said he didn't know what was causing the disturbances, but implied that the building had a dark history that no one wanted to acknowledge. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things and left that night, never looking back. I didn't want to know what had been living in the walls, what had been scratching at me in the dark. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never forget that handprint. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I used to work at a small grocery store in a quiet neighborhood, a place that never had more than a handful of customers at a time. The store was tucked between two houses on a narrow street that didn't see much traffic. It had been in the same family for decades, and the elderly owner, Mr. Tanner, ran it with his son Mark. Mark was a few years older than me, and we'd become friends over the course of the few months I worked there. The store was simple, just rows of canned goods, milk, bread, and snacks, along with a small meat section and some produce. But as much as I'd gotten used to it, there was something unsettling about the place. It wasn't just the low hum of the fridges or the creaky wooden floors, but something deeper. The store was old, really old, and I felt it in the walls, the shelves that had been touched by so many hands, the dust in the corners that no one ever bothered to clean. But it wasn't just the age of the store. It was the customers, or rather one in particular. He was a man in his 40s or 50s, always wearing a long, dark coat that seemed out of place for the time of year. He came in every Tuesday evening without fail, just before closing time, and always bought the same thing, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a small jar of peanut butter. At first, I didn't think much of it, but there was something off about him. His eyes were always glassy, like he hadn't slept in days. His hands shook, and he never spoke. He'd simply walk up to the counter, place his items down, and then stare at me, his eyes unblinking, until I rang him up. I would always try to make small talk, ask him how his day was, but he would never answer. Just silence, except for the sound of his breath, shallow and heavy. It wasn't long before I started to feel a strange tension whenever he walked in, as if the air around him grew heavier, thicker. One night I was working the late shift alone. Mark had gone home early, and Mr. Tanner had left hours before, as he usually did. I was almost done with the shift when the man walked in, just as usual. He seemed a bit more agitated than usual, glancing around the store nervously as if expecting something or someone to be there. He quickly grabbed his bread, milk, and peanut butter and hurried up to the counter, not even glancing at me as he placed his items down. I rang him up in silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I handed him his change, he suddenly stopped, his hand trembling as he took the money. He looked at me with wide, frantic eyes. "I need your help," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. It startled me, since I'd never heard him speak before. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to leave." "But I can't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked around the store like someone was watching him. "He's here." "Who?" I asked, now genuinely frightened. Before he could answer, I heard the sound of the front door opening. The man froze, his face drained of color. I turned to look, but there was no one there. The door had simply swung open, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The man's breathing grew more erratic, and he turned to leave, almost running. But as he reached the door, he stopped and turned back to me, his eyes wide with terror. "You don't understand," he whispered. "He's been following me, everywhere I go." With that, he bolted out of the store, leaving the door swinging in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The door was open, and I could hear the wind howling outside, but nothing else seemed out of the ordinary. I locked the door and went to finish my shift, but I couldn't shake the image of the man's face. It haunted me, the way he had looked at me like he was begging for help, but also terrified of what might happen if I did. The next day, I asked Mark about the man. I told him about the strange conversation we had the night before, about how the man had seemed so scared. Mark's face went pale when I mentioned him. "That's not possible," Mark said, almost whispering. "That man died years ago." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean? He comes in every week." Mark shook his head. "No, he doesn't. He hasn't been in here for years. His name was Greg. He was a regular here, but one night he just disappeared. His wife came in one night asking about him, and we had no idea where he went. Then a few weeks later, we found out he'd been found dead, just a few blocks away. He'd been murdered." I felt my blood run cold, but I saw him. I've been seeing him for weeks now. Mark looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "I'm telling you, Greg died years ago. He was murdered, and no one ever found out who did it. His wife said he'd been acting strange right before it happened, like he was being followed or watched by someone." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to think. Could it be possible that I had been seeing the ghost of the man? I didn't want to believe it, but there was no other explanation. The next few days were a blur. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled over me, but the sense that something was wrong never left. I kept thinking about the look on Greg's face when he left that night, the terror in his eyes. It wasn't just fear, it was desperation. Then, one evening, as I was closing the store alone again, I heard a noise. It was coming from the back of the store, the area where we kept the stock. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The store was empty, or so I thought. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly made my way toward the back. As I rounded the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure standing near the shelves, its back turned toward me. It was Greg. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I stood there staring at the figure, unable to process what I was seeing. Slowly, the figure turned around. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and he was wearing the same clothes I had seen him in during my shifts. But this time, his expression was different. His face was twisted in pain, and he opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. His eyes locked onto mine, full of anguish and terror. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air, the chill of the night air cutting through me like a blade. I never went back to that store after that night. I don't know if it was a ghost, if I was losing my mind, or if something else was happening, but I couldn't stay there anymore. I moved away from the town soon after, and I never spoke of the store again. But every once in a while, I think about Greg, and I can't shake the feeling that he was trying to tell me something. Maybe it was that he knew who had done it, or maybe it was just the terror of being followed to the end. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the look on his face that night. That look of someone trapped, unable to escape, even after death.
Story number 3.
I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. It was the kind of town where nothing ever really happened, and life moved along at a slow, predictable pace. That was until I started working at the old, family-owned hardware store on the outskirts of town. The store had been around for decades, but it always felt like it had been forgotten by time. There were cobwebs in the corners, dust on the shelves, and the floorboards creaked with every step. It had that old, musty smell to it, like something was just barely holding it together. The store had an older owner, Mr. Duncan. He was a kind man, but a bit odd. He lived alone in a house nearby and never spoke much about his past. When I started working there, he seemed like the kind of person who didn't want anyone getting too close. But he was nice enough to offer me a job after I graduated high school, and it was better than working fast food, so I took it. I worked the evening shifts, usually from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. The store was quiet most nights, with the occasional customer coming in to grab nails, light bulbs, or some odd tool. Most of the regulars were elderly people from around the area. But there was one customer, a man who stood out from the rest. His name was James. He was in his mid-40s, always dressed in a worn jacket and jeans, and he had a strange, hollow look in his eyes. I first noticed him about a month after I started working there. He'd come in around 8 or 9 p.m., usually when I was alone in the store. He'd walk in, grab something small, always something different, and take it up to the counter without saying a word. He would stare at me as I rang him up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, not the items he was buying. At first, I didn't think much of it. People had strange habits, and maybe he was just shy or eccentric. But after a few weeks, things started to feel off. His visits became more frequent, and the way he stared at me grew more intense. It was like he was trying to say something without words, and I couldn't understand what it was. One night, I was working alone when he came in. This time, instead of just staring at me, he spoke. "Do you ever wonder if you're really here?" he asked in a soft, almost monotone voice. I didn't understand what he meant, so I just nodded awkwardly and smiled. Not really. Just here to help you with whatever you need." He didn't respond right away. He simply picked up a wrench, stared at it for a moment, and then put it back down. He seemed lost in thought, like he was trying to piece something together in his mind. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to me. Then he turned and left the store without another word. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that crept over me after that encounter. It was as if the air in the store had shifted, and I couldn't quite explain why. The next few nights, he came back at the same time, buying the same random items. He never spoke much, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. One evening, just as the sun was setting and the sky turned dark, he came in again. This time, I was alone in the store, and something about the way he entered made my skin crawl. He walked in slowly, glancing around like he was looking for someone. When he finally saw me, his face hardened, and he came straight up to the counter without picking anything up. You don't know who I am, do you?" he asked, his voice low and almost pleading. I felt a chill run down my spine. Uh, "I've seen you a few times. You come in here to grab stuff, right?" He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something deep and unsettling that made my throat tighten. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said again, his voice shaking. "I've been trying to tell you. They're watching." I didn't know what he meant, but I could tell he wasn't in his right mind. I was about to ask if he needed help when the door opened with a sudden jingle, and I turned toward it. A figure entered the store, a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a cap that obscured most of his face. He walked in with purpose, eyes scanning the aisles, and when he saw James, his expression hardened. James looked terrified, his body stiffening, and he took a step back as if he were trying to retreat. The man walked straight up to him. "You need to leave," he said, his voice cold and commanding. James didn't move at first, just stood there, eyes wide. No, they're following me. I'm not supposed to be here." The stranger grabbed James by the arm and tried to pull him toward the door. "You've been warned," the man said, his voice more threatening now. James resisted, pulling away, but the man was stronger. Before I could say anything, the stranger turned and dragged James out of the store, the door slamming shut behind them. I stood frozen, my heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. I didn't know whether to call the police or just let it go, so I did nothing. But Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange interaction. I had never seen the man before, and there was something unnerving about the way he spoke to James. It was like he knew exactly what James had been talking about, and whatever it wasn't something I was supposed to know. A week later, James came back to the store. He walked in at his usual time, looking disheveled, as if he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were wild, and he was shaking, but when he saw me, he immediately rushed to the counter. "They're coming for me," he said, his voice frantic. "I don't have much time." I tried to calm him down, telling him he was safe here, but his gaze kept darting to the windows like he was expecting someone to burst in at any moment. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate. "I'm not supposed to be here," he repeated, his voice trembling. "They're going to take me." Suddenly, the door swung open, and a cold gust of wind blew into the store. I turned to see the same man from before, the one who had dragged James out. He was standing in the doorway, watching us with a dark, unreadable expression on his face. James let out a cry, turning to run, but the man was faster. He grabbed James by the shoulder, spinning him around, and I heard a low, guttural sound, a sound I couldn't quite place. James froze, his body going rigid. He seemed to collapse in on himself, his eyes blank, like all the fight had gone out of him. I stood there, unable to move or speak. It felt like time had stopped. The man didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. He just dragged James out of the store again, and I heard the door close behind them with a soft click. I never saw James again after that night. I stayed at the store for another few months, but the feeling of dread never went away. I don't know what happened to him, and I don't know what the man was trying to tell me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the store wasn't just a hardware store. It was something more, something like tied to whatever happened that night. I eventually left town, but I've never forgotten James or the strange, dark figure who came for him. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I didn't think it was going to be that bad. My family had just moved into a small house in a quiet neighborhood. The house was older, one of those types that had an unmistakable, musty smell when you walked in. The floors creaked with every step, and the wallpaper had that faded, yellowish look that came with age. We didn't have much money, so it was one of those places that you just kind of have to make do with. The idea was to stay for a few months, fix it up, and eventually move out when we could afford something better. But of course, things didn't go as planned. From the very first night, I knew something was off. I was about 12 at the time, and I'd just finished unpacking my things. The house was eerily quiet. No neighbors nearby, just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional sound of a car driving by. The first thing I noticed was that the house had a way of making you feel like you were being watched. Even when you were completely alone, there was always this pressure, a weight in the air, as if something was there, but not quite visible. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, moving into a new place can be unsettling, especially in a neighborhood where you didn't know a single soul. But as the days went by, things started to get weird. It started with small things, little noises in the walls, the occasional creak of the floor when no one was around, the sound of something faintly scraping at the window at night. I told myself it was just an old house settling, maybe some animals in the attic or a draft. But then one night, things escalated. I was in my room reading when I heard it. A tap. Soft at first, like a gentle knock on the wall behind me. I thought it might have been my younger brother messing around, so I ignored it. But then it happened again, and this time it was louder, more deliberate. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward the wall listening intently. Nothing. I checked the window, the door, and even under my bed. Nothing out of the ordinary. The strange tapping continued that night, just when I thought I had managed to convince myself it was my imagination. But the sound wasn't coming from the wall behind me anymore. It was coming from the hallway, a rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood, the kind of noise that made the hairs on your neck stand up. I was terrified, but I convinced myself it was just a raccoon or something outside. I wasn't about to open the door and check, though. I turned the lights off, buried my head under the covers, and prayed that I'd wake up to a normal morning. The tapping didn't stop, but it grew softer and softer until I eventually fell asleep. It wasn't the last time it happened. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences became more frequent. The tapping came almost every night, followed by the scraping sounds that seemed to follow me from room to room. I tried to ignore it, but each time it got worse, I became more and more convinced that something was wrong with the house. One night, the tapping came again, only this time it was different. The noise didn't just come from the walls or the windows, it came from the attic. I had never been up there, and I didn't intend to go. But the noise was persistent, louder and louder until it felt like it was right above me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed a flashlight from my dresser. I went into the attic, heart racing, but when I opened the door, the space was completely empty. Just a dusty old attic full of boxes and cobwebs, nothing out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back downstairs, locking the attic door behind me, and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The house felt colder now, and the shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The next day, I decided to confront my parents about it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I had to tell someone. When I did, they brushed it off, saying that old houses make strange noises. But that night, things got worse. I was sitting in the living room watching TV with my family when the front door swung open by itself. No wind, no draft, just the door creaking open as if someone was trying to come in. I froze, staring at the door as my heart thudded in my chest. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. My mom and dad rushed over, immediately locking the door again and checking the surrounding area. Nothing. No one was outside, and the door wasn't damaged in any way. It didn't make sense. After that, things started happening even more frequently. The door would open on its own every night, and sometimes the lights would flicker, casting strange shadows in the corners of the rooms. But the most disturbing thing was what I started seeing in the mirrors. At first it was subtle, a shadow just out of the corner of my eye. But then it became clearer. I'd look into the mirror and see someone standing behind me. Always just behind me in the reflection. But when I turned around, no one was there. It was always the same figure. A tall man, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. His face was pale, his hair long and matted. He would stand there just watching me, always standing in the same place. I'd blink and he would be gone. One night I saw him again, but this time it wasn't in the reflection. I was standing in the hallway, about to head into the kitchen when I was standing at the end of the hall. His figure was barely visible, just a silhouette in the dim light. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, my body unwilling to move. The figure took a slow step forward, and in that instant, I bolted. I ran down the stairs, screaming for my parents, but by the time they got to me, there was nothing there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept my eyes wide open, terrified that I'd see him again. And I did. He was there, standing just beyond the foot of my bed, watching me with those hollow eyes. I closed my eyes, hoping that if I ignored him, he would go away. But when I opened them again, he was still there. The next day, my parents decided to leave for a weekend trip, thinking that maybe I just needed some time to relax. They left me with a neighbor who had been kind enough to watch the house while they were away. I hated being alone, but I agreed. That night, I locked every door and window in the house. But when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I heard footsteps in the hallway, faint but unmistakable. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to even look out from under the covers. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could hear it just outside my door. Suddenly, the door creaked open. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear as the sound of footsteps entered my room, slow and deliberate. I could feel the weight of someone standing near me, watching me in the dark. The next morning, I packed my things and left the house. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know what was in that house or what it wanted, but I wasn't willing to stay there to find out. To this day, I still don't know what I saw or if it was even real. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't human. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was the summer of 2008 when I moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street. My family had been searching for a new home for months, and this place was a bargain. The moment I stepped inside, I could tell something was off, but I brushed it aside. It was an old house, after all, and they all had their quirks. The creaky floorboards, the dust-covered windows, the faint smell of mildew, these things were just signs of age, right? At first, nothing happened. The house felt cold, even during the summer, but I assumed that was due to its age and the lack of proper insulation. It wasn't until the second night that I started to feel like something was wrong. I was alone in the house. My parents were away on business, and I was upstairs in my room, reading. It was late, and I had just started to doze off when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, deliberate knock on my door. I was still for a moment, thinking it was just the house settling, but then the knock came again, louder this time. I froze, staring at the door, my heart thumping in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I got up cautiously, opened the door, and peered into the hallway. There was no one there. I checked the other rooms quickly, but they were all empty. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The house was old, after all, and old houses made weird noises. I went back to my room, shut the door, and locked it. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The knocking on my door wasn't the only thing that had happened. I could have sworn I heard soft whispers coming from downstairs, but when I went to check, there was no one. The next few days were a blur. I started noticing more strange occurrences. Lights flickering for no reason, cold spots in the house, and objects moving on their own. At first, I thought I was just tired, maybe imagining things, but the events only became more frequent and unsettling. One afternoon, I was downstairs in the kitchen when I felt a presence behind me. I turned around quickly, but again, there was no one there. Just the empty kitchen, the cold air, and the hum of the refrigerator. But it wasn't the first time I'd felt this way. I had begun to feel like I was being watched constantly, as if someone was always standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. And when I did, there was nothing. By the time my parents returned, I had stopped mentioning the strange happenings. They thought I was just adjusting to the new place, and I didn't want to worry them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house was no longer just cold, it was oppressive. The air felt thick, like it was pushing in on me, suffocating me. It wasn't until one night, when I was sitting in the living room alone, that things took a darker turn. The front door, which I had locked earlier, suddenly swung open with a loud creak. I jumped to my feet, heart racing, and rushed to close it. But when I touched the doorknob, I noticed something strange. There was a dark stain on the wood, as if something had been dragged across it. I stepped back in shock, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I had just cleaned that door the day before, but the stain was real. As I stood there, staring at it, I heard a soft whisper coming from the hallway. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. In the dim light, standing in the doorway of the hallway, was a figure, a tall, thin figure draped in shadow. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, frozen in place as the figure slowly stepped toward me. The air grew colder and the whispering grew louder, filling my ears with unintelligible words. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure reached out a hand, and I finally broke free from my stupor. I sprinted to the back door and slammed it open, running into the backyard. I didn't stop until I reached the street, gasping for breath, my heart racing. That night, I didn't go back inside. I called my parents, telling them I was staying with a friend. I couldn't explain what had happened. I couldn't make sense of it. But I couldn't go back into that house, not after what I had seen. The next day, I went to a local historian, hoping to find some answers. When I described the house and its location, her face went pale. She told me the house had a dark history, one that wasn't mentioned in any of the town's official records. The house had once belonged to a family that had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. There were rumors, of course, whispers about a murder, a betrayal, and something worse. But no one knew for sure what had happened. All they knew was that after the family vanished, the house had become cursed. According to the historian, people who lived there often reported seeing strange things, figures in the shadows, voices in the walls, and inexplicable cold spots. The house seemed to have a life of its own, a malevolent presence that could not be escaped. The family that had once lived there was never found, and their disappearance remained a mystery. When I returned to the house later that day, I found my parents were already home. They hadn't noticed anything unusual, but I could see the concern in their eyes. I didn't tell them what I had learned. I didn't want to scare them. But I knew that I had to leave. That night, I stayed in the guest room, away from the area where the figure had appeared. I kept the lights on, but every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I could hear the whispers again, soft at first, but then louder, as if someone was standing just outside my door. I could no longer tell what was real and what was imagined. I could no longer escape the house, and it felt like it was slowly suffocating me, closing in on me from all sides. I began to see the figure more frequently, always in the shadows, always just out of reach. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to find it standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. One evening, as I sat in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, getting closer until I could hear them right outside the living room. The door creaked open, and the figure appeared again, standing in the doorway. This time, it wasn't just a shadow. I could make out the faint outline of a face, pale, hollow eyes, and a mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I screamed and ran, but I couldn't escape. The house was closing in on me, and there was nowhere to go. The next day, we packed our things and left. We never returned to the house. The town later confirmed that the house had been abandoned again, as if no one could ever stay there for long. But I still have nightmares. Every now and then I hear the whispering, the footsteps, and I know that whatever is in that house never really left. Story, the end.